Hi there everyone, it's Joe and welcome back to my Starter Deck Re-volved series. And as you can see, I am no longer blonde. I have now kind of fulfilled my full Kuja fantasy and I've gone for a full kind of lilac and blue look here. I hope you guys like it, as I certainly do. Anyways, we're going to be talking about the Final Fantasy VII starter deck this time round, and I just wanted to make sure that everyone was clear on how I build these decks, because I think a couple of comments in the last video made it apparent that I wasn't explaining my reasons for doing certain things particularly well. So I wanted to make sure that everyone knew that I put 2 hero cards into this deck and no more than that, simply because I want it so that people who are just getting into this game can literally pick up a starter deck and a few packs, and you know, their play groups can help them pick up the commons and uncommons and things like that, so that it's really easy for people to get into this game. So I just want to make sure that everyone knows that that's not an official rule thing, and it is definitely something that I've just come up with because I want people to be able to access these decks really easily. That being said, we're going to go straight in with the deck now, and just like the other starter decks in the series that I've made here, we've got 23 forwards, 18 backups, and 9 summons. There we go, I'm going to get it right in a sec. 9 summons. So thank you very much for watching. If you want to see how this deck pans out, then just keep on watching. So we'll get started with the fire forwards, and it wouldn't be much of a Final Fantasy VII deck if it didn't have Cloud in it. So we've gone for 4 different copies of Cloud here. Well, 4 of 2 different copies of Cloud. So we have 2 of the starter deck Cloud, which is nice and easy because everyone can get it by buying the starter deck, and he's actually pretty solid. Like he fell to the wayside in favour of things like Light Cloud, but he's actually not a bad card anyway. So you can run 2 copies of this because you're running enough Final Fantasy VII forwards that will make him cheaper, and his S ability can actually go off quite frequently in this particular deck because it's just, you know, you've got plenty of ways of searching him up, you've got things that can, having 4 of him just aids consistency. So we have 2 copies of him, and we also have 2 copies of the common Cloud from the Opus 3. Now this Cloud I think is actually very, very strong. It can attack by having an FF7 forward other than himself on the board. He has Brave, which means he can attack without dulling himself, and because of that he can then use his other ability to increase an attacking forward by 2k on himself, which means that he is a 9k attacker for 3 CP, which is actually very, very strong. So I definitely recommend at least 2 of this guy. And then we're going for 3 copies of Tifa because she's in the starter deck and she's very, very strong. She's on curve at 8,000 power for 4 CP, and she has a nice useful S ability. It's not going to come into play that often, but it's still very, very good. And then we've gone with 2 copies of Warrior of Light from Opus 1 because Warrior of Light is just an extremely good value unit. If your opponent's got something that you don't really want to deal with, then leaving a Warrior of Light on the board means they're probably not going to attack you if it's too big because they're going to end up dying to him. And then if you manage to get a Labrow out, it's even harder to get around him. So I definitely like having Warrior of Light. And then 2 copies of Imaginary Brawler, which is the mannequin from Dissidia for Tifa, and I really like this card. I think I also featured it in my Final Fantasy IX deck because I think it's quite so strong. It's on curve at 7,000 power for 3 CP, meaning that its power and its CP align quite nicely in comparison to other units. And its ability is just very, very strong generally, and it's just something that you're definitely going to want to be able to push the game forward with. And then finally for fire forwards, I've gone with 3 copies of Sync, or Sank. I forget how she's pronounced properly. The French word is Sank, but a lot of people have corrected me to say that it's Sync. But Sync is here because she is there to make it so that your opponent has to block your large forwards, and because your forwards are quite so big, they kind of have to, you know, they want to get rid of your Sync as quickly as possible so that they don't end up having to succumb to her. And because her S ability is actually quite handy anyway, but it isn't necessary, she's just a very, very good unit and one that you'll get used to using very quickly. Now this next card I wanted to go over quite quickly which is Barrett, and there are 2 different copies of Barrett in this deck, which I don't actually think Barrett is a particularly bad card. A lot of people don't really like Barrett, but given that we're trying to stay on theme with the Final Fantasy VII theme, and he's quite powerful for the cost that he gives. He's only 2 CP for the one that we're running 3 of for 6k power, and has an ability that makes it so that you don't really want to block him with anything that's 8k or less because it might end up dying anyway. And he's quite nice just to sit on a back burner. And then we're running a single copy of the rare one, primarily so that we can, you know, just capitalise on the S abilities as much as possible. And the S ability on this one is actually quite strong. So even though we're only running 1 copy of it, you can still make use of his S ability to your advantage, and he makes your Clouds cheaper. He's searchable by Jessie. By being FF7 affiliated, he actually fits into this deck quite nicely. But if you didn't really want to run Barrett, you could easily run cards like Seraphy or Scarmiglione if you wanted to instead. They're also very, very good. I then added in 2 copies of Vincent from the starter deck because, again, he's in the starter deck, which means that it's very easily acquired. And being a first striking attacker, he's actually pretty solid anyway. Again, in combination with things like Cloud, who can make him 1,000 bigger, or Barrett, who can like deal damage to your opponent's boards while you're attacking, he's just very simple, but he's also quite powerful when when he gets his momentum going. He's actually pretty solid, and he's also worth getting hold of now, because when you eventually if you do want to pick up the game any further, you're eventually going to want to pick up legendary copies of Vincent. So having this Vincent is handy just so that you can pay for his abilities. So I definitely run a couple of copies of him, especially yet again he's FF7 affiliated, so he kind of just fits in quite nicely. And then someone who's not FF7 affiliated is 2 copies of 3-drop Deleter. Now Deleter is like a staple in a lot of Earth decks simply for his ability to kill off your backups and be a massive presence on the board so that you're allowed to then replace them with additional copies of themselves, because cards like Rauban, which we are running in this deck as our hero card of the deck, you generally want to use more than once. So it makes sense for Deleter to be in this deck because you can use a Rauban, for example, and then play Deleter afterwards, kill it off, and that leaves you room to play another one, because obviously with the rules in Final Fantasy TCG being what they are, you can't have 2 copies of the same character out. So I wanted to include this card in this deck mainly to just kind of enforce and teach that rule. And then lastly, we're going with a single copy of Berserker, because a lot of people don't like Berserker. I actually do. I think that by being a 3CP 8k forward, and the name of this deck is just straight up power, people who play green in Magic will probably quite like this, and it's very simple and it's very easy to play, and you're just going to snatch games from people, and it's really good deck, and it's really good fun. And so for somebody who's just picking up a starter deck and a couple of boosters, I definitely really like this deck. Berserker is just something that's just exemplifying the fact that we're going for raw power, and by being 3CP and 8k, the downside of having to attack every turn and not being able to form parties is not that big a deal. So I like running 1 copy of her in this. Now the backups in this deck are more of the same sort of thing really. It's all about just beating your opponent's face in, and it's nice and easy. So we're running 2 copies of Lebreau in here because the deck is primarily fire based, so we wanted to make sure that your dominant colour within your deck is getting power boost. And if you're running wind instead of earth, you generally want to run Maria, which is like a global power booster, as well as your own colour's power booster, so that you're getting 2,000, because you'd be surprised in this game how much of a swing in momentum that makes. So we're going with 2 copies of Lebreau here for that exact reason. And then we're going with 2 copies of Common VV because it's an EX burst that burns things. And it's, there aren't that many great 2CP backups in Fire. I mean, you could opt to run Bard instead of this card if you wanted to, because it does actually kind of play into this quite nicely. But I like VV because of the EX burst and the fact that it can ward early game plays away from you. And that's why I decided to put it in here. But again, this is your deck and it's not necessarily there for me. So if you want to change the cards in here, then by all means do so. And then we're going with 2 copies of Red Mage. Now, Red Mage is a card that's very difficult to argue with. Just a good 2CP value backup that makes it so your opponents can't block you. It's just a very good card, and it's run in pretty much every fire deck that I can think of, so there was no reason not to put it in here. And then we're going with a single copy of Zangan. Now I know normally that when I run a searcher for a card, I normally run 1 copy fewer than the card that I'm searching for if it's for a specific card. So normally, because we're running 3 TVs here, I would run 2 Zangan. But because we're running 2 copies of Jessie in the Earth backups, which can search for any Final Fantasy VII forward, I figured that 1 Zangan was probably enough. And then we're going into a copy of Selfie, which is again a pretty heavy staple in a lot of fire decks just because it's so versatile. Being able to just give your guy 2,000 power makes it so your opponent may think twice about blocking you, because they're going to end up losing their guy for doing it. And again, it's just a very solid card. And then lastly, we're going for a single copy of Teller, because Teller can remove like big threats from the board, which you don't want to have to come under too much fire from units that are too big for you. I mean, luckily a lot of the forwards in here are very value heavy, so you're going to get a lot more power than you're paying for. But there are going to be situations where you're going to want Teller to be able to remove something off the board that's causing you problems. So I like to have 1 copy of Teller in this deck. Now going into Earth backups, as I said before, we're running 2 copies of Rauban here, and Rauban is the hero card that we're presenting in this deck, and there's a good reason for that. Rauban is a card that every new player should aim to get hold of as quickly as possible because it's very commonly run in Earth decks, very commonly. So it's worth picking it up. I mean, there are counters to Rauban, but they're all quite hard cards to get. Things like Legendary Aerith, who is in Opus 3, can counter Rauban, but the positives for this card far outweigh the negatives, and it was a card that I actually didn't like all that much when Opus 2 came around, and I was a complete idiot for it, being quite brutally honest with myself. So I definitely think that this is the card to pick for this deck. And then we're going with 2 copies of Monk, because much the same reason that we're running Selfie and things like that, or Bard if you chose to run that over VV, is because it's just more power. It's a very, very good value unit. You're getting plus 3k and Brave, and because you don't have to necessarily use the Brave from this, you can attack, have your opponent block you, and then crank it by 3k. Yes, it will cost you your backup, but it will cost them their guy, and that's a much, much bigger swing in momentum in your favour. So I like copies of Monk in practically any Earth deck. And then I've gone with a single copy of Machinist because it's just a little bit of removal for a cheap cost. You could choose to run Tama instead of this card. You know, Tama's very, very good at colour fixing and things like that and playing cards in your opponent's turn, but I like Machinist because I think it plays in nicely with the theme of this deck of just brute force and smashing your opponent's head in, basically. And then 2 copies of Jessie, because it searches practically every forward in this deck. It comes in the starter deck, it's just a lovely auto-include, realistically. And then 1 copy of Masked Woman. Masked Woman is a card that can destroy your opponent's forwards, and it's just very, very useful to pave the way for you to attack your opponent. And then lastly, we're going with a copy of Rydia, who is, again, pretty much a staple in most Earth decks from Opus 3 at this point, just because being able to search up any summon from your deck is so versatile that it's actually just quite hard to argue with. So I like a copy. We've gone with 4 searches in total in this deck. We've gone with 1 Zangan to search for Tifa specifically, 2 copies of Jessie to search for any of your FF7 forwards, and 1 copy of Rydia to search for your summons. So you're not going to have too much problems with consistency with this deck with any luck. And then the last sort of bit of the trifecta, if you will, is the summons of this deck. And we're going with 2 copies of Belias, because I think Belias should go in every fire deck, because it's something your opponent just can't see coming necessarily. It's, you attack with it, your opponent then blocks you, and then you give yourself a K, first strike, and you draw a card out of it. You can get so much advantage out of this playing this card that I find it difficult to not play this card, honestly. And then we're going with 2 copies of Brynhilda. Brynhilda is a card that I don't ordinarily like very much, but then I don't particularly think that summons are Fire's strong point, generally speaking, except for Belias. But in this deck, you know, heavy removal, brute force, all of that is the name of the game with this deck. So I wanted to put 2 copies of Brynhilda in there, and it's easy to get. It's very easy to get copies of Brynhilda, so that for a new player, it just makes sense to have her here. And then in the Earth summons, I've gone with 2 copies of Golem, because again, it's all about the combat tricks and brute force, so making your guys bigger, like, you know, the way the green would work in a game of Magic the Gathering. It just, you know, it's your giant growth in this deck, and it just makes sense for it to be here. Now, one of the cards that I think hoses this deck quite nastily and is quite a hard counter to it is Minwu. And because of that, I wanted to run 2 copies of Hekaton in here, because it's one of the few cards in the game that can destroy backups. And if there is something that's getting in your way, or, you know, is hosing you down like a Minwu would, because it prevents any kind of damage that isn't fatal, then it's worth having copies of this card. You won't like fall down too heavily to Minwu if you're careful, because it's all about my guy being bigger than yours rather than the burn. But things like Brynhilda and Ralban, you kind of want, or Barrett, things like that, you kind of want to be able to get around the card, and others, Aerith being a good example as well, the one that I mentioned earlier. Hekaton can still deal with that. And then lastly, we're going with a single copy of Atomos, because, you know, you still want more removal, and I think that having a copy of Atomos in here, as well as the 2 copies of Ralban, makes it so that you actually have quite a large suite of, you know, getting rid of your opponent's forwards to leave things that can't be blocked because of your red mage or your imaginary brawlers. And basically you are just literally just going, I don't care what you do, I'm going to do my thing, I'm going to make my guys big, and I'm going to smash your head in. And that's pretty much why I like this deck, because it's nice and simple, and it's very, very easy for any new player to grasp. So that's it for this video, and yeah, we've still got 2 more decks left to go when it comes to the Starter Deck Re-volved. I will leave links in the description box to the Final Fantasy IX and Type 0 decks that I hope you guys will enjoy as well. Thank you very much for watching, and subscribe to the channel, obviously, because that's why we do these things. We want all this stuff to be, you know, well liked and all of that. Press like buttons, press the little thumbs up, share it out with people who want to get into this game, because I'm really enjoying the game, and I'm sure there are a lot of other people that are as well. So thank you again for watching, and I'll speak to you all soon. See you later.